When you think about why cannabis became illegal, the story we all heard was about protecting public health, but that's not even half of it. The real story? Well, it's about a handful of incredibly powerful men, their own personal fortunes, and a full-on war they declared on a plant. So, let's get into what really happened.
All right, so let's set the scene. It's the 1930s. The country is in the middle of the Great Depression. Everyone's focused on just getting by. But behind the scenes, a completely different kind of fight was starting to take shape, a fight that would end up changing our laws for almost 100 years.
And that really brings us to the big question, doesn't it? The official story, the one they wanted everyone to believe, was all about keeping people safe. But the moment you start to follow the money, a totally different story starts to unfold. So, was this a noble crusade for the public good? Or was it really just about greed and control?
Okay, so first things first, we've got to tear down that official story. This idea that cannabis was some huge societal evil didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, it was carefully and very cleverly constructed through a massive propaganda campaign.
You've probably heard of reefer madness, right? The public was just flooded with these wild, over-the-top stories. They blamed this new, foreign-sounding drug, and they specifically called it marijuana, for literally everything from violent crime to people going insane. It was designed to create a full-blown panic, and honestly, it worked.
But here's the thing. That whole panic wasn't some grassroots movement. It was all orchestrated from the very top. We're talking about a small circle of guys whose motives had pretty much nothing to do with keeping people safe and everything to do with protecting their own massive empires.
So, who were these guys? Let's pull back the curtain and meet the key players in what you could call this anti-cannabis cabal. These are the men who used their money, their media empires, and their political connections to turn a totally useful plant into public enemy number one.
First up, we've got the money guy, Andrew Mellon. This man was one of the wealthiest people in America. He was a banker, an industrialist, and, this is the key part, he was the Secretary of the Treasury. Mellon liked to work from the shadows, but make no mistake, his money was the fuel for this entire operation. For Mellon, this was all about business. He had a ton of money invested in DuPont, which was rolling out brand new synthetic fibers like nylon. And what was a huge potential competitor to nylon? You guessed it, hemp. At the same time, cannabis itself was a natural alternative to some of the synthetic drugs his pharma companies were making. So for him, it wasn't about morals. It was just about his bottom line. Okay, so Mellon's got the cash. Now you need someone to spread the message. Enter the media mogul, William Randolph Hearst. If Mellon was the muscle, Hearst was the megaphone. His massive newspaper empire was the perfect machine to get the anti-cannabis story out to every corner of the country.
And Hearst's reasons were just as self-serving. He owned huge forests and paper mills, and hemp was a much cheaper, better alternative for making paper. So what did he do? He turned his newspapers into weapons. He made a point of using that foreign-sounding name marijuana over and over again, and then he launched this disgustingly racist smear campaign, just making up stories to connect the plant with minorities and crime. It was a cold, calculated way to use fear to protect his profits.
And that brings us to the guy who would become the public face of this whole war, Harry J. Anslinger. He was the enforcer, the guy who would take all the money from Mellon and all the media hype from Hearst and turn it into a relentless government crusade.
Anslinger's job was no accident either. Get this. He was Andrew Mellon's nephew-in-law. Mellon appointed him to be the very first head of the brand new Federal Bureau of Narcotics. But then, when Prohibition ended in 1933, his whole agency was suddenly out of a job. They had no one to go after. He desperately needed a new villain to justify his budget and to grow his own power. Cannabis became his perfect target.
I mean, just listen to this. This is a direct quote from Anslinger himself, and it tells you everything you need to know. He flat out used racism as a weapon, painting this insane picture where jazz music and cannabis were teaming up to destroy the moral fabric of white America. This was never, ever about science. It was pure, ugly prejudice.
So let's just connect the dots here, because this is the crucial part. You've got three incredibly powerful men. Each one has his own selfish reason for wanting cannabis God. Mellon wants to protect his financial investments. Hearst wants to crush his business competition. And Anslinger wants to build his own little empire on a foundation of fear and racism. It was the perfect storm.
So they've got the public worked up into a frenzy. They're terrified. The cabal was ready for its final move, turning their personal, corporate, and racial agenda into the law of the land. This was their masterstroke. And just look at how fast this all went down. Anslinger gets the job in 1930. A few years later, his agency needs a new mission. The propaganda machine goes into overdrive, and boom, by 1937, in less than a decade, cannabis is effectively illegal across the entire country.
Now, the law itself was, well, it was genius in a really sneaky way. It wasn't called a prohibition bill, it was called the Marijuana Tax Act. But in reality, the taxes and the rules were so ridiculously complicated and expensive that it was basically impossible to comply. It was a ban disguised as a tax. It was designed from the ground up to destroy the hemp industry and criminalize anyone who used cannabis.
So you might be wondering, where was President Roosevelt in all this? Well, for FDR, this was just political math. He was in the thick of fighting the Great Depression. He needed powerful businessmen like Mellon and Hearst on his side. He needed to keep conservative lawmakers happy. In the grand scheme of things, sacrificing cannabis was, for him, a small price to pay to achieve his bigger goals.
And we have to talk about this, because this wasn't just some dusty old law passed almost a century ago. The actions of these men set off a chain reaction, a domino effect of consequences that we are absolutely still dealing with right now, today.
And this is why this history matters so much. This one law led to decades of prohibition. It wiped out the American hemp industry. It led to millions of people being arrested, and disproportionately, that meant people in minority communities. But maybe worst of all, it created a national policy that was based on corporate greed and racism, not on science or public health.
At the end of the day, when you strip everything else away, this is the simple truth. The war on cannabis was never really about the plant itself. It was a calculated campaign driven by two of the most powerful motivators in human history: profit and prejudice.
And that kind of leaves us with one big, pretty unsettling question, doesn't it? If a law this impactful was built on the selfish agendas of just a few powerful men, how many other laws that shape our lives today were designed not to protect us, the public, but to protect them?